Hey gang, what's going on? Today we're talking about the Great Depression and the New Deal, getting into the 1920s. We looked at the first side, the other side of the 1920s, which was almost like a great big party. Now we're going to show the other side, mainly the economic side, and try to explain some of the factors that led to the great economic downturn that we call the Depression. Well, first, I want to point out that the 1920s is a response to the progressive era. We saw a lot happening with the expansion of government powers. You saw Theodore Roosevelt, you saw Woodrow Wilson, and then you saw the Great War. And what you're going to see is a reaction to all of that, the return to conservatism. And a lot of people are going to characterize, a lot of historians are going to characterize the 1920s a lot like you would characterize the 1880s and the beginning of the 1890s. So it's a return to the idea of laissez-faire and support of big business. So as the title suggests, this is the Republican 20s. And there are three pillars of the Republican establishment that we're going to take a really good look at. One of them is Warren G. Harding, who's elected in 1920 and is the first Republican president since Theodore Roosevelt. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt wasn't really a Republican like Warren G. Harding is going to be. Then is Calvin Coolidge, best known as Silent Cal. And then finally, the last Republican president to be in the White House until the Great Depression hits is Herbert Hoover. Now, although Calvin Coolidge said it, I think you can sum up the philosophy of the 1920s, and especially that of the Republican Party in the 1920s, with the business of America is business. It's a return to an emphasis on capitalism and laissez-faire, and a turn away from the sort of government expansion, especially in the economy, that we saw in the progressive era. So when you think about it, the conservative economics of the 1920s is a reaction to what we've seen in the past few decades with the progressive era. Look at what we've gone through. We've gone through participation in a major world war. We have not seen this since the Revolutionary War. All of our wars have been more or less domestic, with the exception of the Spanish-American War, but again, that was not a world war. That was us against Spain. We've also saw the rationing of food and resources as a result of that war. That's something that Americans are not used to. We've also seen some major social movements, such as women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment. Enfranchising half the population is a major move. We've also seen prohibition in the 18th Amendment, so the sale and manufacture of alcohol has been made illegal. So all of these, in a way, can be seen as the fulfillment of progressive ends, right? The progressives always wanted to engineer a better society through the use of government, whether that be local, state, or federal, and to some extent, they got what they wanted as a result of World War I. So in 1920, with the exception of the former Confederacy, the South, the nation turns wholeheartedly to embrace its first Republican president since Theodore Roosevelt. And you got to put an asterisk by that because Theodore Roosevelt wasn't much of a good Republican, splitting with the Republican parties to form the Progressive Party in 1912. So we turn to Warren G. Harding. Look at him. Conservative. He looks very conservative. Laissez-faire. And definitely Republican. His inaugural speech, I think, sets the mood for a lot of what you're going to see in the 20s. Let's look at it. America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. He invents that word, normalcy. That hadn't been a word until Warren G. Harding said it. Not revolution, but restoration. Not agitation, but adjustment. Not surgery, but serenity. Not the dramatic, but the dispassionate. Not experiment, but equipoise. Not submergence in internationality, but sustainment in triumphant nationality. Don't you like his use of parallel rhetoric there? The world needs to be reminded. No, you're letting your eyes glaze over this. I want you to go back. Look at this. The world needs to be reminded that that all human ills are not curable by legislation. You didn't pay attention. Go back and read it again. The world needs to be reminded that all human ills are not curable by legislation. Did you see what he just said there? Who's he talking to? He's talking to those progressives who tried to fix the world through the extension and empowerment of government, whether it be state or local or city or national. He's saying that, look, we've got some problems in this world that government cannot fix. And he goes on, and that the quality of statutory enactment and the excess of government offer no substitute for the quality of citizen. Now I can hear some of you Tea Party people out there applauding. Yes, he's our guy, Warren G. Harding. He's telling us that, look, government legislation is not going to fix all the world's problems. Whether you agree or don't disagree, that's up to you. But this is definitely characterizing the spirit of the age, that, yeah, we're going to turn our back on progressivism and we're going to embrace a much more conservative social and conservative economic policy. Well, much like John F. Kennedy late in 1960 and Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 said he was going to gather around him the best minds that the Republican Party had to offer. And turns out they're all from Ohio. They're called the Ohio Gang. And so who you got running the country is Charles Evan Hughes as Secretary of State, Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury, Herbert Hoover, who you remember from running the Food Administration during World War I, is going to be the Secretary of Commerce. And then you're going to have this guy, and keep your eye on him, Senator Albert Fall of New Mexico. Now, he's going to turn out to not be a very trustworthy character. He's a scheming anti-conservationist. Remember, TR was into conservationism. Albert Fall, as Secretary of the Interior, he's supposed to be, but he's not. So he's going to be appointed Secretary of the Interior, and he's the guardian of the nation's natural resources. But the problem with Albert Fall is he's not much of a conservationist. He does not really think as TR did. Well, as we said, progressivism is going to get the axe. This age of the 1920s is a reaction to progressivism, and we're going to see a lot of it, the progressive measures overturned or reversed. So, for example, Warren G. Harding is going to appoint 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices, including William Howard Taft, and these are going to be really, really conservative guys. And the court, like the country, is going to take a hard turn to the right, to the political and the economic right. Now you say, wait a minute, this is not supposed to be, this is not how the court is supposed to function. The court is supposed to, of course, interpret the law and apply it. The court is not to be legislators. And I've told you this. This is what our Constitution says the court is to be doing. Yes, in theory, that is what the court is supposed to do. But you guys have been around long enough, and you've now seen enough Supreme Court cases, and you've seen how the Supreme Court has acted from John Marshall to the present, to know that the court is not above its own biases, that they are, in a sense, a creature of its time. And the Supreme Court in the 1920s is no different. So, for example, now I'll show you this. They struck down a federal child labor law, believing in the absoluteness of laissez-faire. They stripped away the gains that have been made by labor unions during the Progressive Era. And they eroded government oversight of the economy. One court case that we want to highlight is Atkins v. Children's Hospital in 1923. Here, the court rules that because women had the vote, as the 19th Amendment, that they're now legal equals to men, and they're not entitled to any special consideration in the workplace, even when they are pregnant. So you can say, well, yeah, that's of course not. They've got the vote, they got everything, it's their choice, they got pregnant. Okay, maybe, fine. Your opinion on this, fine. However, what the court is saying in 1923 is no special consideration even when you are pregnant. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's going to sit on the bench for quite some time, is going to write the majority opinion. He says it would need more than the 19th Amendment to convince me that there are no differences between men and women, or that legislation cannot take those differences into account. So there you see him taking a swipe at the progressive era. Funny thing about Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes is he was appointed by TR, and TR thought he was going to be a friend and an advocate to the progressive moves, and he turned out to be a lot more hostile to progressivism than TR had ever thought. But what are you going to do? These guys are appointed for life. You can't get rid of them. So, does the court have a position? Yes, courts, they're supposed to interpret the law, but as you have seen, the courts are creatures of their time and place. Here's another piece of important legislation that we got to look at. It's how the taxes are going to be reorganized following World War I. Remember what happened? You guys saw that the tax rate during World War I really went sky high, up to 70 or 80% in some cases are going to be, in a sense, confiscated by the federal government in order to prosecute the war. And I use that word confiscate. I thought about not using that word confiscated, but when you have a government that is seizing up to 80% of your earnings, what do you call it? I'm sorry, there I am. You're calling me a Tea Partier. I'm not going back on the word confiscated. Okay, so there we are. Look at the tax. Look at the tax brackets as up to 1921. Okay, study that for a second. Look who's paying what in 1913 through 1916. That is when we first got the 16th Amendment, which gives us the income tax. Look who's paying what. Okay, if you're making $2,000, you're not paying anything. If you're making $10,000, you're not paying anything. If you get to $20,000, which is a lot in 1913, you're giving up 1%. Then look, okay, down there to, if you're up to $1 million, if you're one of those people making $1 million, you're paying 7%. Now, this is not affecting a lot of people. Go to 1918. What happens? There we are. World War I is in full swing. Who's paying money? 76%. 7 to 76%. Now, you can say, oh, Gillespie, that's not a big deal. Who's making $1 million? Well, nobody. I mean, really not a lot of people at all. The big industrialists, sure, but look at how tax rates have increased. And they even went up. If you were paying nothing in 1913, you're paying 6% in 1918. That used to be a tax that was really reserved for people making $1 million. Look at 1921, people. Look at 1921. Tax rates are going down. 4% on those on the lower income brackets, and then you go to 72% if you're making $1 million. Now, okay, you're saying, yeah, but that's not that a lot. Look at what happens under the Mellon Plan. The Mellon Plan is going to call for the lowering of taxes across the board, but placing the heaviest burden on the middle class. He believes, okay, that top income earners are the producers and the job creators, and you saw this under William McKinley. It's called trickle-down economics, okay? Look, what do you see? What do you see? Taxes across the board are going to be lowered, but those seeing the largest proportion, the drop, are going to be the top income earners. So those people making $500,000 and more in 1921 were paying 71%. Look at what's happened to them. They have dropped to 45%. By 1926, their tax rates have dropped to 25%. Look at the people making $1 million, also 46 to 25%. 1924, 1926, respectively. What's the big idea here? Understand what trickle-down economics is. You don't have to agree with it. I'm not saying this works or does not work. This is a matter of debate among historians and economic historians especially, but understand what the purpose of trickle-down economics is supposed to do. By lowering the tax rates at the top on the top income earners and on businesses, you are supposed to be generating more wealth that is going to fall down to the rest of us. And I want to give you a pop quiz time. Look at this. Look at this. Which other U.S. president believed in a form of trickle-down economics? Would it have been William McKinley? Would it have been Ronald Reagan? Or would it have been George W. Bush? Which one believed in a form of trickle-down economics? You can go ask your parents. You can go do this. Put it on pause and come back. Oh! So you guessed it. That's it. It's all of them. All of them to some degree are going to champion what Reagan calls supply-side economics and what McKinley calls trickle-down economics, what George W. Bush's dad, called voodoo economics. He wasn't as much of a fan of it. But all three of these guys, all of them Republicans, are going to champion this idea, which is popular in the Gilded Age. It's popular in the 20s. It's popular in the 80s. What do all these ages have in common? They're all really conservative eras dominated by Republicans. Now you're thinking, you're out there, you're like, wait a minute, Gillespie, wait a minute, because I have it in my notes here and I can see you. Yes, I'm looking through the screen and I can see you. You're going through your notes. And you're saying, wait a minute, the 16th Amendment gives us the income tax, and the income tax was there to generate revenue, and that revenue was to make up for the tariff that Woodrow Wilson had lowered. How are we going to make up with the lost revenue? Oh my goodness, we're back. Republicans love tariffs. They haven't stopped loving tariffs, and they're going to continue to try to promote tariff policy throughout the 1920s. So look what's going to happen. Okay, remember Woodrow Wilson's Underwood Tariff of 1913, same year that we got the 16th Amendment for the income tax. In response to that, so that the government can continue to function and have bring in some kind of revenue, Woodrow Wilson is going to lower the income. Woodrow Wilson is going to implement the income tax. Woodrow Wilson is going to lower the tariff, that Republican tariff that had always been so sky high. Now, changing the guards, the Republicans are in town. Look what happens. The Fortney-McCumber tariff, two good Republican congressmen reintroduce a plan to raise that tariff high again, 38.5%. So again, who loves tariffs? Republicans love tariffs. Now, Republicans don't love tariffs today. That's an interesting change that we have seen. But in the 1920s, Republicans loved tariffs. So, duties on farm produce are going to be increased, and the principles proclaimed that general rates were designed to equalize the cost of American and foreign competition. Presidents Harding and Coolidge got this down, authorized 32 tariff hikes, including on their list vital commodities like dairy products, chemicals, and pig iron, with only 5 reductions. So, what do you know about the 20s? The 20s is a time of high tariffs once again. One scandal that the state of Texas wants us to know about is having to do with Albert Fall. Remember, I told you to keep your eye on Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, part of the Ohio gang, appointed by Warren G. Harding. Well, in 1923, evidence has come to light that Fall, that has secretly leased government oil reserves, secretly leased, it's in quotes, government oil reserves in a place called Teapot, Wyoming. And he did this to private companies, and he did it to line his own pockets. He did it for a bribe. So these are these private companies that say, I'd like to use this land, I'd like to drill for oil, and what is supposed to happen is they are supposed to compete on the open market. That's what laissez-faire and capitalism are about. Instead, Albert Fall is secretly giving them the rights to do so. He personally profits $300,000 from what becomes known as the Teapot Dome scandal in 1923. And he becomes the first presidential cabinet member to be arrested, convicted, and spend time in jail. All of these things. Albert Fall took the fall. It confirms Democrats' fears, or seems to confirm Democrats' fears, that the Republican Party was in league with big business, and it weakened public confidence in government. Now, was it ever a Republican that was doing this? No, certainly not. It was Albert Fall and some of his less moral Confederates. In fact, Warren G. Harding probably didn't know a thing about any of this. And the poor man is going to end up dying anyway, without it really tarnishing his record. But as it was going on in 1920, 21, there's very little evidence to suggest that Harding knew anything about it. It's time for another one of my annoying pop quizzes. Let's talk about what other presidential scandal caused public opinion of government to drop into the gutter. Could it have been Grover Cleveland, who the press blew the whistle on when they found out that he had fathered an illegitimate child? Could it have been John F. Kennedy, about whom it was widely whispered that he was carrying on several illicit extramarital affairs, including one with superstar Marilyn Monroe? Could it have been Richard Nixon, about who likely had knowledge of a break-in at the Democratic National Convention for guys working for him so that they could gather dirt on his presidential opponent? Or could it have been, or could it have been this one, William Jefferson Clinton, who had a extramarital, what do you want to call it, inappropriate relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, who caused the biggest scandal? Really, it was these two. Grover Cleveland and JFK were more or less given a pass by the press when they became presidents. This was the patriotic duty, or what they saw as the patriotic duty of the press in an earlier age. They don't report on the president's private life. They leave that to his own affairs. Nixon, on the other hand, was definitely into something that was a little more than private. Okay, Nixon was very likely at the center of a national scandal called the Watergate break-in. He very likely had knowledge of some burglars who were illegal breaking into the Democratic National Convention so that they could gather information on his Democratic opponent to use in the upcoming election. He resigned before he went to court, but the evidence is almost beyond the shadow of a doubt. He was very likely guilty. Bill Clinton, another one that we're going to learn about later on. Bill Clinton had an inappropriate relationship, as he put it, an improper relationship with I think she was a 23-year-old White House intern while he was president of the United States. He did that on the taxpayer's dime. And while what really got him in trouble over the whole thing is somebody was a guy named Ken Starr was investigating another scandal about some investments that he and Hillary had made. He uncovered this business about Monica. And Clinton, when asked about it, he lied. He lied under oath. And that is what makes it such a scandal. I mean, the president going on and doing these things is scandalous, but what got him impeached for it, not removed from office, but impeached for it, was his lying about having any kind of relationship with Miss Lewinsky at all. In August of 1923, Warren G. Harding had a stroke and died, leaving it to his predecessor to take over the presidency. Now, this was going to be an election year anyway, and so Calvin Coolidge, another super conservative Republican, is going to run for the presidency on his own right. And you can see the results of the election of 1924 right there. Again, the whole country is in red, except for noticeably the Solid South, which continues to vote Democrat. No, we never vote Republican, says the South. So it's expected to be no big and abrupt change. Nobody looks at Calvin Coolidge and says, oh, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? Not much. He believes in a very inactive presidency. He believes that the government that governs best governs least. And so there you can see the ghost of Warren G. Harding guiding his pen, so to speak. And what's he going to do? Not much. He is going to support big business. Calvin Coolidge is known for saying the man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. So very, very pro-business stance. His campaign slogan was "Keep cool with Coolidge." You can't do too much better than that. Coolidge, as we said, was no progressive. Coolidge was no radical. He's an ardent defender of the status quo. Like his predecessors, he opposed most progressive legislation. He champions big business, business over workers, and he remains steadfastly committed to the policy of laissez-faire. He did take some moves to strip away some of the gains that progressives had made. He stripped the Federal Trade Commission and the Tariff Commission of their powers. And he opposed the breakup of the mammoth U.S. Steel Corporation, which was in fact a monopoly. He believes that combinations in business are inevitable and that legislation is going to do very little to stop that. He also vetoes what's called the Muscle Shoals Bill. This is a bill that Herbert Hoover is also going to veto, even in the Depression. It's a bill to provide electricity to an impoverished area of Tennessee. And he's going to veto it on the grounds that it would be government-owned. You see, the folks of this impoverished area of the Tennessee Valley do not have a whole lot of money, and because they do not have a whole lot of money, that is not a lot of incentive for businesses to move in there. So they tend to ignore that place and leave it in poverty. And the government has been saying, or progressives had been saying for a while that the government should move in and provide that electricity for that area because it would stimulate economic growth. But because it would be government owned, and yes, that is the definition of socialism, when the government controls the means of production, that is why Calvin Coolidge is going to veto that. And later on in the Depression, we're going to bring this bill back, and people are going to say, let's get jobs moving again through this, and Herbert Hoover is also going to veto it. Oh, yeah, I have it right there for you. Hoover is going to veto it again in 1931. Calvin twice vetoed aid to farmers on the grounds that aid that would come from the federal government. So he does not believe that it is the place of the federal government to give these, as he would put it, these handouts, even to farmers who had been overproducing. See, farmers have run into some problems because a temporary relief to their problem of overproduction came with World War I. Suddenly, we can't produce enough. So they take the bait, they put more acres under cultivation, and then the war ends, and what are you going to do now? Now we've got all these falling crops. On the international scene, Calvin Coolidge is going to be a lot more aggressive. Remember, America had entered World War I in 1917, delivering what proved to be the fatal blow to the German onslaught just as they were about to overwhelm the Western Front. This had cost the United States quite a bit of money and quite a bit of manpower, but mainly money. The Allied nations, Britain and France, are in debt to the United States. Now, Coolidge is not going to want to forget about that. Europe is in a tough place. Okay? Europe, the beginnings of the Great Depression are beginning over there. Countries like Germany are really dragging the rest of Europe down with it because Germany's having to pay that tremendous reparations, which was stipulated by the Treaty of Versailles. So Europe's like, hey, we can't pay. We need some relief. We need some time. Well, America paid for World War I, says Coolidge. Now pay us back. Now. Well, cooler heads prevailed, and a couple of U.S. congressmen proposed what becomes known as the Dawes Plan. Don't confuse this with the Dawes Act of 1887, which is about dividing Native American lands up. This is the Dawes Plan. So the idea is that the USA, the chief creditor, is going to pay Germany. And you think, what's this about? Okay, Germany is the chief debtor. Germany owes tons of money, billions of German marks. And so the U.S. is going to try to kickstart the German economy by pumping money into it. So Germany will use that money and it will develop its economy. It will invest in it, will hire. And then once it gets the pump primed, so to speak, and the economy is moving again, then Germany will pay the Allies, Britain and France. Now, what the Allies are going to do with that money is they're going to turn around and they're going to develop their economies, they're going to hire, and they're going to invest. And when their economies are in a position to do it, then they're going to pay the Allies back with interest. So the idea here is that the United States is going to fund the recovery of Europe. So there it is broken down for you a little bit more. Start with the United States, which is going to send $2.5 billion in loans annually to Germany. Germany is going to pay $2.0 billion, so it's going to keep some of that for the purpose of investment and hiring and give it to the Allies, and the Allies are going to pay $2.6 billion back to the U.S. So this is an idea to keep the European economy afloat. The problem is not with the plan itself. The problem happens to be with the U.S. economy. You see, the U.S. economy is growing and growing and growing, but this is the 1920s, and a lot of that growth is artificial. Well, Calvin Coolidge serves out his one term, and he believes that the presidency should not be a powerful character, that the president should step down when it's time. And he, after a rather successful term, a booming economy and a lot of successes, he says, I don't care to run again. And Silent Cal steps down, says, forget it, see ya, goodbye. And so that leaves a presidential vacuum in 1928. Now, the Republicans are going to offer the former Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. He's a known progressive. You don't know this about Hoover, but Hoover is actually a progressive, but he's on the conservative wing of progressivism. He believes in efficiency. He does not believe in what he would see as an overreaching government. Herbert Hoover, major humanitarian. You don't know this about Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is responsible for saving more lives than I think any other person in history. You're like, wait a minute, Gillespie, that's a stretch. I'm not so sure it is. You need to look into Herbert Hoover's humanitarian efforts in Belgium and Russia. Okay? I don't have a ton of time to go into this now, but if you Google those, that would be an amazing thing. Now, the Democrats have this guy on offer, Al Smith. Now, you've never heard of President Smith, so you can see where this is going. But let's look at why Hoover was so successful and why you've never heard of President Smith. Herbert Hoover was the head of the Food Administration during World War I. He was Secretary of Commerce under Harding and under Coolidge. Smith was governor of New York. Not a bad position, but he was governor of New York. Now, Hoover is an all-American from Iowa. Herbert Hoover represents that sort of can-do attitude of the Midwest. He's who America is identifying with right now, with that can-do capitalist laissez-faire attitude. Smith is the son of Irish immigrant parents, and, oh my goodness, he's got more going for him. Herbert Hoover believes in laissez-faire. Smith is a progressive reformer who is skeptical of the free market. Herbert Hoover believes that the 18th Amendment, prohibition, is a good thing and that national experiment is working. Herbert Hoover himself does not touch the drink as far as we know. Smith favors the repeal of the 18th Amendment. That is prohibition. Now, look at what else Herbert Hoover and Smith have. Hoover was a Protestant. In fact, he was a Quaker, which they're known for pacifism. But he's a Protestant. He's got these Quaker roots, speaking all the way back to our founding under Pennsylvania. So he's got this sort of American image about him. Smith. Let's look at Smith. Smith was a Roman Catholic. Let's look at it again. Yes, you heard me. Protestant. Smith was a Roman Catholic. You're saying, what? Still, in 1928, the fears that many Americans have about the Catholic Church are intense. So here's somebody's cartoon. Cabinet meeting, if Al were president, who's running the thing? The Pope is running the show, and what all the cardinals are gathering around the table, and look, you have this waiter bringing in all of this booze. So the feeling is that as a Catholic, he's ill-equipped to run the country. The Republicans had a little jingo that they circulated about him, and they said Al Smith will bring rum, Romanism, and ruin. Oh, the 3 R's: rum, Romanism, and ruin. As you can see, Herbert Hoover had absolutely no problem winning the presidency in 1928, with the noticeable exception of the Solid South, who continues to shake its defiant little fist at the Republican Party and say, no, 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 we're never going to vote for you. Now, Herbert Hoover did make some inroads into the South. Al Smith was not as popular as some of the past Democrats have been, but nevertheless, not popular enough to break apart the Solid South. Some concessions made, yes. Texas defects to the Republican parties. No, we're not here to stay. Florida defects to the Republican Party. No, it's not there to stay. But you do have the South voting for a candidate that is absolutely opposed to just about all of their interests. The South is strongly in favor of prohibition. Al Smith is not. The South is strongly in favor of provincialism and states' rights. Al Smith is not. Al Smith is, well, not the South's guy, but they hold their nose, they go into the voting booth, and they vote Democrat, because that's how we do it down here. Now, Herbert Hoover, you know, he wins. Another super conservative Republican is going to sit in the Oval Office. I want you to pay attention to Herbert Hoover's campaign speech in 1928. It's one of these things that I think he wishes he had never said. When you read it, I think you'll figure out why. He says, the greatness of America has grown out of a political and social system and the method of control of economic forces distinctly its own. Our American system, which has carried this great experiment in human welfare further than ever before in all history. We are nearer today to the ideal of the abolition of poverty and fear from the lives of men and women than ever before in any land. Now, I'm saying this is the line I think he wish he could take back. Listen to it again. We are nearer today to the ideal of the abolition of poverty and fear from the lives of men and women than ever before in our land. Okay, yeah, because in just a year we're going to have the Great Depression, and then we're going to be closer to the everybody living in poverty and fear than we ever have been. So again, this is one of these really ironic statements which he couldn't have known at the time. Nobody did know at the time. But if he could go back in his time machine and pull those words back into his mouth, I bet you he would do it. Anyway, continuing. And I again repeat that the departure from our American system by injecting principles will jeopardize the very liberty and freedom of our people, will destroy the equality of opportunity, not alone to ourselves, but to our children. So he's talking about government intervention in the economy, and he does not believe that it is a good thing. He says that it will threaten equality and opportunity. So, no government involvement in the economy. Poor Hoover. He never saw it coming. Nobody saw it coming. It's not his fault. He couldn't have done anything that anybody else wouldn't have done. This is simply beyond anybody's foresight. But it happens on October 29, 1929. The stock market in New York suffers its greatest drop in history, losing 90% of its value within the next couple of days. Know this date, October 29, 1929, a turning point in American economic, social, and political history. The beginning of the Great Depression. So, it's called Black Tuesday. You've got 16,410,030 shares of stocks were sold in a save who may scramble. Investors were willing to sell their shares for pennies on the dollar because they were simply holding on to the worthless certificates. This marks the beginning of the Great Depression. But you're asking, wait a minute, I don't get it. How did it happen? How do we suddenly have a great debate? To answer that question, we've got to step back into the 1920s and find out. So let's go back to better times, back to the 1920s, back to the time when we were listening to Babe Ruth on the radio and watching Jack Dempsey box and Charles Lindbergh was flying across the Atlantic and we were fighting about evolution down in Tennessee and the KKK was, well, popular. Back to the good old times, right? So, the 1920s also saw the rise of something called a consumer economy. Let's look. Okay. This is a gauge. Refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and radios. Okay. In 1920, 1% of American households had a refrigerator. By 1929, that has jumped to 8%. So this is big, okay? Lots of folks now owning these things. Washing machines. In 1920, 8% of American homes had washing machines. By 1929, this has jumped to 24%. 9% of American homes own a vacuum cleaner, and by 1929, 30% of American homes own a vacuum cleaner. And radios. 1% own a radio in 1920. By 1929, that's up to 46%. So this is a big jump in the amount of stuff that people can have. Yeah, wages are rising, people have more money to buy stuff with, but there's more to it. Also, Henry Ford. Who can argue about the impact of the automobile? In 1910, we're at under 1 million cars on the road. By 1920, there are 8 million cars on the road. By 1929, there are 23 million cars on the road. What else, besides the internet, have you ever seen catch on with such popularity and with such in a major and almost immeasurable economic effects? The automobile and the internet, they stand as one of the major inventions to improve, or let's just say change, okay? Improve is a judgment call, so let's just say change the quality of life for a lot of people. How are we getting it? Look at the sign above this lady as she's making her purchase. Just say, charge it, she says. Americans, for the first time, are buying in massive numbers on credit. Buy now, pay later. Don't worry, I'll get that raise, I'll get that promotion, we'll pay it off. Don't worry, better times are coming for us. I'm about to graduate with my liberal arts degree. We'll be rolling in it. Let's do it. So, American manufacturers, you remember, created an excess of consumer goods, and the public cannot possibly consume all of these goods. Remember, we had Albert Beveridge saying that we're making too much, that's why we need the Philippines to go sell it to them. Advertisers had to convince people that they needed to buy crap. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. They spent millions creating demand. Look at advertisements. You ever really analyzed an advertisement? They spend a lot of time telling you how much your life sucks and how much better it would be if you would just buy whatever it is we're selling. Think about that. That's what they do. They create demand by doing that, by telling you your life is empty without it. Producers want to sustain growth. Wages or purchasing power simply could not keep up. So this is a problem. When you see companies making more than consumers are consuming, that is if we were doing it with another country, that would be called a trade deficit. But we have that within our own population. There's more crap on the shelves than people can buy, and more money is pouring into advertising, and it's still not solving this problem. Well, the answer is to convince people to buy on credit. Why don't you just buy it now, pay later? The economy will only improve after all. Things are only going to continue to get better. There'll be time. Go ahead, enjoy that new car, enjoy that washing machine, enjoy that refrigerator. There'll be time to pay for it later. So as a watershed in American history, the 1920s saw a majority of Americans owed more money that they had in the than they had in the bank. Now this is the norm today. Your parents, if they're homeowners, probably have a mortgage. And they probably owe more than they have in the bank. Now, maybe they don't. Maybe they're fantastically wealthy, wealthier than I am. And they own their home at 40 years old. That would be great. That would be wonderful if people did that. But a lot of people spend their whole lives paying off their house. And so the stuff that I have, I actually owe on. I'm a debtor. I don't own my home. I don't own my car. I have to keep going to work all the time. I even carry a balance on my credit card. This is getting depressing. Another cause of the Great Depression. We looked at a debtor nation. We looked at overproduction. What else is going on? Wages are going up. Look at the average real per capita measure of disposable income. Look at who's growing. Look at that green line. Who's that represent? That's the top 1%. And their earnings are going up and up and up and up and up. And look at everybody else. Down at the bottom. You can barely see them. That's not just the end of the graph. Those are lines. The U.S. average is flat. The lower 93% of folks who are not working are flat, or I'm sorry, not working on a farm are flat. Farm averages is flat. So the top 1%, they're seeing their share of disposable income just skyrocket. Everybody else is not. Top 1%, their income went up. Everybody else is staying the same, but they are expecting to live like millionaires, and so they're buying on credit so they can keep up with that 1% and show everybody all of the new consumer goods that they have. I mean, who really are you anybody if you don't have the latest Model T? Hey, so let's live it up. It's the 20s, and in the words of Prince, let's party like it's 1929, baby. And we do. And we run that tab up on the national credit card so high that nobody can even see it anymore. It's another cause of the Great Depression that we need to point out. It's called playing the market. You see, in the 20s, the stock market was relatively unregulated. This means there's just not a lot of government oversight over what you can do on Wall Street. Very few rules. Just about anything goes. Well, corporate profits were so high in the 1920s, artificially high in the 1920s, that what these corporations would then do is they would take their excess profits and they would then feed the market by buying more stock. You see what's happening? Companies taking their excess profits and putting them into the market itself in order to drive prices up so that more people would be attracted to buy into this. So this is a way of artificially feeding the market. This is actually illegal today. You can't drive your own stock up by buying into it. But in the 1920s, if you could drive the value of your stock up through excess profits, then that would entice more and more people to buy in, and then you'd make more money. So anybody can buy what's called stocks on margin. Write that down. Understand what this is. Stocks on margin. So this means that all you needed in some cases was just 10% of a stock's value in order to purchase it. 10%. So if a stock is worth $100, all you need is $10 in order to buy that. Now you're in it for the whole $100. You own that, okay? But the idea is that, well, it's going to stay. It's not going to stay at $100. It's going to continue to rise and rise and rise. And if that stock splits, that means if it increases that much, the idea is to sell and then pay your debt off and you pocket the rest. So it's a gamble. It only works if the economy is growing, if prices are rising. If you take a downfall, then you're going to be in it for that 10% and everything else. So on the eve of the crash of 1929, the financial situation looks like this. You have real money as measured by the gold standard. Remember, the U.S. is still on the gold standard. We're not switching to silver. So you've got this measure of this real money. And then you've got this pretend money, what I'm calling pretend money, as measured by the stocks, the inflated value of goods and services. So people are dealing with a lot more credit and real or pretend money than there actually is real money in the Treasury. This is not a good recipe, folks. And so back to the floor of the stock market. In October of 1929, we don't know where it started. We don't know how it started. We don't know what exactly caused this problem. But somewhere, at some point, one of these guys that you're looking at out there decided that it wasn't real. And he caused a panic. Somebody said sell. Somebody else said, well, he's selling. That means that the prices are going down. Let's sell. And then other people looked around and said, those guys are selling. We better get out before the prices get too low. And they sold. And then somebody else said, let's sell. And then you got companies that are saying, let's sell. And then the prices are dropping and dropping and dropping. Companies lose up to 90% of their value. That's AT&T, for example. It's one I know. AT&T lost 90% of its value with the drop of the stock prices on October 29, 1929. Well, the panic begins what is known as a ripple effect, and it actually starts before Black Tuesday on something called Black Thursday. This is the beginning of the panic, the beginning of the tremors that you see before the stock market hits free fall. And this is when people start noticing that prices are beginning to drop. A little bit more substantial than we've seen in the past. You know, the market, it goes up and down, but this seems a little bit extreme. People start selling, and when other people start selling, other people get nervous and they say, well, if they're selling, that's going to drive prices down. I'd better sell. And so you start to see a massive sell-off. By the following Tuesday, the stock market has entered free fall, a massive sellout of just about everything anybody is holding. Major companies such as RCA lose up to 90% of their value in a single day. Major companies such as Ford Motor Company take a massive hit, losing up to 85 to 90% of their value in a single day. This is massive. And so if you're holding on to stock that's losing 90% of its value and you don't see any bottom to this, what are you going to do? You're of course going to try to sell it as well. And then this leads to what's called bank runs on the bank. People needing to pay off their loans and people trying to get out of this with their shirts on their backs. They run to their bank and they literally take out all of the money that they have. Hi, I'm Joe Investor. Give me everything in my name. Well, if everybody wants everything that's in the bank, it causes the bank to collapse. The bank is dependent on investors and investors' confidence. And if you take everything out of the bank, then guess what? The businesses fail. Why do businesses fail? Because, hey, I want to start up a business, but I don't have the capital, so I go to a bank and I ask for a loan. Well, the bank says, guess what? There's no money there. We can't take a risk on anything. This is a really bad market to start a business. And so, to make things worse, we're calling in all of our existing debts. So not only are banks unable to loan anything to start up businesses, you get a lot of business failures because nobody has the capital to keep these things alive. Of course, the final step in this is when businesses close down because banks cannot keep them alive and you've got corporations that are losing 90% of their value. This is going to cause a major and massive and huge and super significant leap in unemployment. People are literally losing their jobs. This is through no fault of their own. This is simply the consequences of a market in free fall. This is one of the more interesting images that I can come up with to dramatize what happens to certain people overnight. So have a look at that guy in the center. He looks like a pretty well-dressed guy. He's got some nice shoes. He's got the double-breasted suit and the bowler hat, and he's got a very nice automobile parked on the side of the road there. And this is this ordinary makeshift homemade sign. $100 will buy this car, but you gotta have cash. I lost everything on the stock market. This is symbolic. This dramatized. This stands as synecdoche for what happened to lots and lots of people. Because as we said, a lot of folks had a lot of wealth, but a lot of it was artificial wealth, not backed by anything substantive, but backed only on credit. So let's have a look at bank failures versus business failures and analyze the relationship. 1929, you had 659 bank failures and 23,000 business failures. This is a consequence of the stock market going into free fall and then the runs on the banks and then all of the banks shutting their doors and all of that. So the relationship is pretty clear. By 1930, you've got 1,352 bank failures, and look at the number of businesses that are failing. It's not getting any better. It's only getting worse. When you think about businesses failing, that's not just a lack of consumer goods that's available. Those are people's jobs, folks who get up every day and go to work at these businesses, and all of a sudden they're being told, you don't have a job anymore because we cannot keep this afloat. By 1931, we're looking at 2,294 bank failures and 32,000 business failures. So things are getting worse and worse and worse. And you're saying, well, all this was caused by the stock market? No, it wasn't. I want to reiterate that. The stock market crashing did not cause the depression. The stock market crashing was a symptom of the underlying house of cards that was the financial system of the 1920s. So, bank failures, the big picture here, business failures follows bank failures, and what happens on the heels of that is massive unemployment. The way to track what is happening is by analyzing income versus spending. In 1929, you've got the average income at $705, and then the spending is right up there at $634 per capita. These numbers are pretty close, and so what inference can one make from these numbers? The inference is that people are pretty much spending almost everything that they've got, right? It's all going from, hand to mouth. It's people are buying consumer goods, they're going out to eat, they're going to speakeasies, whatever, they're having a great time. By 1930, spending is income is 625. It's dropped quite a bit, and look at what's going on with spending. It's dropped quite a bit as well. Now, every time spending drops, that's somebody that's not getting paid. That's a business that is not selling, and that's a job that is unable to hire. By 1931, look how much income has dropped. It's to 531 per capita, and 487. So people are saving a whole lot more than what they used to. And you can say to yourself, saving is good. We should save. We should not spend everything we have. And in a sense, yeah, you're right. I would definitely advise you to save rather than spend frivolously. But also keep in mind that in a consumer economy, in a capitalist economy, it is dependent on you spending your money. It is dependent on you going out and spending it at the movies or spending it at the store or spending it, at the Gap, because that is what keeps people employed. So, the big picture here, as income went way down, Americans were actually reacting to that by spending less of it, which in a seemingly ironic way, people are acting more responsibly with their money, but what it's actually doing is causing a major slowdown in the economy. So, gauging unemployment, 1928, wow, we've got hardly any unemployment in the country. This is why Herbert Hoover could say as he was running for presidency that we are nearer to the abolition of poverty than we've ever been. By 1929, wow, okay, 25%. So that's a really big shift to see happen virtually overnight. We go from 4% unemployment to 25% unemployment. And you say, well, what kind of relief is there? What kind of social safety nets or anything are there? Does the government have any recourse for this? And the answer is no. There is no such thing as direct relief. Now, in times of economic stress, we do have federal and state programs for welfare, for food stamps, and some kind of public aid. There's public housing, there's job trainings, there's all of these things that we can rely on. There is nothing in 1929. There is no public welfare, and certainly nothing provided by the federal government. Herbert Hoover, in 1931, when pressed to institute something like this or to consider some kind of public relief, he responds by saying, "To solve this problem," that is the Great Depression, "in this way accords with the fundamental sense of responsibility, neighbor to neighbor, community to community, upon which our nation is founded." And look at his words. This is 1931. The Depression is underway. No governmental action, no economic doctrine, no economic plan or project can replace that God-imposed responsibility of the individualism and of the individual man and woman to their neighbors. That is a vital part of the very soul of a people. So Herbert Hoover very strongly believes in something that he calls rugged individualism. He very strongly believes in the power and the initiative of the individual to take care of him or herself and not to rely on any kind of relief from the government. So he does not believe that's a legitimate function of government. And he's going to hold to that doctrine all the way to his death, even through the Depression and into the early 1960s. I think he finally dies in, don't quote me, but 1963. And he's going to be a defender of this doctrine all the way. Now, Hoover asks for certain things. He does not want to pass legislation. You remember Herbert Hoover did not want to make the World War I rationing mandatory. He didn't believe it was government's job to demand these things. But he asks for something called volunteerism. He asks for businesses to keep employment, wages, and prices at current levels. But what he's asking is for a stream to run uphill. This actually, it runs contrary to economic law. If I am having trouble keeping my lights on, so to speak, then I'm not going to be able to keep my employees at the current wage. I'm going to have to cut employees. I'm going to have to cut wages. He also asks for local and state governments to provide aid. Now, this is not the federal government, and he does not want to involve the federal government in providing direct aid to people. So he does endorse and asks local and state government to do this, but nothing from the federal government. He also says that churches, families, and neighbors and private agencies should meet the demand through charity. And this is all very good, and I don't think there's anybody, Democrat or Republican, who would disagree with these measures. However, they do not work. The businesses cannot keep people employed. Local and state governments are going bankrupt, and they cannot provide relief. And churches and families, private charities, when you're talking about 25% unemployment, then they cannot reach the need. It is too great. But nevertheless, Herbert Hoover tells us, and this is something that you need to internalize, because this is Herbert Hoover's commitment to his laissez-faire doctrine and to his doctrine of rugged individualism. He says, "I do not believe that the power and duty of the federal government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering." Okay, read that again. You let your eyes glaze past it. I want you to go back. This is Herbert Hoover's belief. "I do not believe that the power and duty of the federal government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering. The lesson should be constantly enforced that through the people, that though the people support the government should not support the people." Look at it again. The lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people. He does not believe government should provide direct aid. He believes this will weaken a person's moral fiber if he receives some kind of handout. Now, I know that some of you on the political left out there are getting really mad at Herbert Hoover, and maybe some of you on the political right are getting inspired by Herbert Hoover. Wherever you stand is up to you. But here's what I want to point out. This is something historians and history books often overlook. Herbert Hoover was very much in the business of giving direct aid to people. Herbert Hoover was very much in the business of meeting the demand of starvation by going to people and putting food directly in their mouths. And I mean that literally, because when Belgium and when Russia were starving to death in a crisis, in a famine of 1919, Herbert Hoover, the man went over there personally and went door to door, shack to shack, and he put food in people's mouths. So I don't want you thinking, oh, Herbert Hoover, the evil Republican, he's not going to do anything. He's going to let people starve. He's not into direct aid, but this is because he went over to Soviet Russia and he tried to do these things. And every single time, or the majority of his efforts, I should say, were thwarted by authoritarian government that would take the aid that Herbert Hoover was trying to provide and they would give it to the army and let their own people starve. And this is why Herbert Hoover is so skeptical of empowering government. This is why Herbert Hoover doesn't want to see government taking on the role of providing for its citizens, because he has experience with authoritarianism in Soviet Russia. Now you can say, oh, Gillespie, that's not fair. The New Deal isn't authoritarian Russia or something. And okay, sure. Argue it as you will. We can argue it in this class. I think it's a great topic for the purpose of discussion. But this is where Herbert Hoover's coming from. He's not coming from a place of evil maliciousness where he just, starve. No, that's not Herbert Hoover. He firmly believes that what he is doing is best. So where you come out on this is your business, and I think we should discuss it in class. But I don't want you to go thinking that Herbert Hoover just laid back and fiddled while Rome burned or something. That's not true. Well, real or imagined, people did not look at Herbert Hoover as a very active president. What you're looking at is called a Hooverville, which is a makeshift community made out of cardboard boxes, made out of just about anything that people can throw away. And these are these little tiny, or sometimes very big and sprawling communities that were named after the president that they believed had put them there. So in 1929, he's claiming prosperity is just around the corner. In 1928, he says this. In 1929, it seemed to be very far away indeed. Now, one of the myths, I think, that has come to us about the New Deal or about the Great Depression is that it was caused by people simply not wanting to work, that somehow we had gotten caught up in laziness and no one wanted to work anymore. This is absolutely not true. Most Americans, when you look through the documents, when you look through what people say and how they recall the Great Depression, people who lived through it very, very much wanted to go to work and were willing to do just about any work that would come their way. The problem was there were no jobs to be had. Have a look at this guy. Work is what I want. I want work and not charity. Who will help me get a job? 7 years in Detroit, no money, sent away. I will give you the best of references. This is a man who's willing to stand out in the middle of the street telling you, look, I'll do whatever it takes. Also, you've got kids out there. Why can't you give my dad a job? These guys, I think, epitomize the attitude of a lot of Americans. Wanted a decent job by a decent man, age 37, family, war veteran, paying on a home. I'm college trained. Another guy, I want a decent job. I'm a family man. So the Great Depression was not caused by people being lazy or not wanting to go to work. The Great Depression was caused by an unsound financial situation. And people were willing to do whatever it took to get their families fed and to get their feet back on the ground. The problem was we do not have, and the world does not have, an economic system that will support the kind of jobs that people are now trained to do. A very ironic and iconic photograph from 1930, I believe. There you've got a car advertisement in the back advertising the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And then you've got all these people standing in a bread line or a soup line or waiting for some kind of relief. And the Depression did not affect all classes or groups of people equally. Minorities tended to suffer much greater than white people. In the North, blacks were the first to be fired, last to be hired, and this is a very sad situation in which you have 25% unemployment anyway. In the South, the sharecroppers were thrown off of the land in which they once worked. And while you see what the white unemployment rate in 1932, we said was around 25%, the black unemployment rate was up to 50%, or as you go into the Deep South where racism and industrial jobs, or racism was greater and industrial jobs were less, you're looking at black unemployment of up to 80% in some areas. One quote from the Times, a document from a guy named Clifford Burke writing in 1970 says, "The Negro was born in Depression. It didn't mean too much to him. The American Depression, as you call it, there was no such thing. The best he could be is a janitor or a porter or a shoeshine boy. It only became official when it hit the white man. If you can tell me the difference between the Depression today and the Depression of 1932 for a black man, I'd like to know it." So a bit of cynicism right there about us calling this the Great Depression, about historians calling this the Great Depression. He says, look, black people have always been in depression. Now suddenly it hit the white guy and it makes news. The American farmer, who hasn't had a very positive story since the days of the populists, is also hit doubly hard. You remember the Homestead Act? Well, under the Homestead Act, over 3 million people applied for grants from 1862 to 1900. They voted themselves a farm, but what people did is they knew very little about crop rotation or of soil erosion or of scientific farming techniques. And so, as a result, they did not conserve soil, they overproduced. They put more land under cultivation, and when they put more land under cultivation, it loosens the topsoil. And we're not practicing crop rotation. We're not putting nitrogen back into the soil. We're not replenishing the soil. And so what this does is it causes the topsoil, the upper layers of the Earth's crust, to become desiccated. They dry up. And so when a wind comes by, it tends to kick up this topsoil and kick it into the sky. So by the 1930s, there was enough loose topsoil on the Great Plains to fill 8,000 fully loaded trains. So just think about that. Imagine 8,000 trains and now fill them all with dust. And what do? You get the potential for a really huge ecological disaster. So by 1933, the worst thing that could happen happened. You're like, wait a minute, so we're in the midst of the Great Depression? Yeah. And then we're going to get an ecological disaster? Yeah. And we couldn't wait on the ecological disaster until the Great Depression was over? No, we couldn't. Drought conditions come to the plains in the middle of the Great Depression. The topsoil, which was already dried out, dries out even more. And all it takes, of course, is a strong wind. And what do you get? You get the Great Dust Bowl of the 1930s, in which the dust kicked up so high into the sky that it actually started to collect on the ships that were floating in New York Harbor. That's right. People could wipe their dust off of the tops of ships in New York Harbor. This is the area that was most affected by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, or by, I should say, the ecological disaster. The Dust Bowl is the part in the yellow there. It caused, of course, by soil and wind erosion, and it causes storms all the way from North Dakota into Texas. And the Dust Bowl, you hear of this Dust Bowl, actually refers to the worst affected regions there on the high plains of Texas and in Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico. in Colorado, and that's where conditions were the worst. So you hear of something called the Okies. We'll get to them in just a sec. You might believe that the bright side to all this is maybe they'll stop producing quite so much and that will drive prices up. But in fact, that doesn't happen. What actually happens is that prices begin to fall. The cause was the overexpansion of farming during World War I. Look at what wheat is costing, or what it's fetching for the farmer in 1919, $2.16 a bushel. Then we demobilize and we no longer have to feed all of France and England, and look at that, it drops to 38 cents a bushel by 1932. So this is a really devastating thing to happen on top of the Great Depression, on top of the Dust Bowl. Now you've got these falling agricultural prices. Cotton was 35 cents a pound in 1919, and look at what happened. Poor cotton, 6 cents a pound by 1932. Well, of course, no one can live on these prices, and the West begins to go bankrupt. Between 1930 and 1934, the banks, which are holding the loans to all of their land, foreclosed on nearly 1 million farms in the West. 1 million farms in the West. They're going out and they're saying, you can't pay your debts anymore, you can't pay your mortgages anymore, you got to give up your land. And the way this would take place is the bank would actually hold a public auction in order to redeem the loan. And so if some guy couldn't pay off his mortgage, he couldn't pay off his land, then the bank would try to auction it off to his neighbors in the hopes that someone out there would buy it from him. But what actually happened was that friends and neighbors would be more sympathetic to their friend, to their neighbor, to their fellow farmer than they would to the bank, and they would hold penny auctions. That means that, sure, I'll buy it back. And people would agree that no one is going to buy this guy's land. No one's going to buy our friend's land for more than a penny. Sometimes it would be $1, but you can see the point. It's a way that that friends and neighbors rallied around each other in order to support each other and not allow the bank to collect the mortgage. It would not allow the bank to foreclose on somebody's home. So this is a way that friends supported one another during the Great Depression. Of course, not everybody is so lucky as to have their land bought back for a penny. You've got tens and thousands of these refugees who have to abandon their plots in Texas or Oklahoma or in the worst affected areas. And they flee. They go further west. These are called the Okies or the Arkies. And they are going to get on these big trucks, as you can see, and head further west. And this is the Exodus that's portrayed by John Steinbeck in his book, The Grapes of Wrath. So here you are, you can see the pictures of these, forlorn people who have lost everything the bank has collected on their farm, and they've got no other choice but to head to Southern California and try to restart there. The Mexican-American civil rights leader Cesar Chavez, who we will learn about later in the 1960s, gives us a vivid recollection of what it is like to have to move from your home in the West and keep on becoming one of these Okies or these Arkies. He says, I remember having to move out of our house. My father had brought in a team of horses and wagon. We had always lived in that house, and we couldn't understand why we were moving out. When we got to the other house, it was a worse house, a poor house. That must have been around 1934, during the worst of the Great Depression. I was about 6 years old. We had been poor, but we knew every night there was a bed there, and that this was our room. There was a kitchen. It was a sort of settled life, and we had chickens and hogs, eggs, and all of those things. But that all of a sudden changed. When you're small, you can't figure these things out. You know something's not right and you don't like it, but you don't question it, and you don't let that get you down. You sort of just continue to move. As I had mentioned before, Herbert Hoover was not Nero who fiddled while Rome burned. He did take active steps to try to combat the problems associated with the Great Depression. Now, one of the ways that he did this is by banking on old Republican philosophy, which is to try to protect the industries, protect the American businesses that were still left on their feet. And he did do this by approving what is known as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1932. Now, you know, a tariff is, of course, a tax placed on imports, which makes foreign goods more expensive, and it preferences goods made domestically. So you recall the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which was already very high at 38.5%. Well, thinking that he wants to protect American businesses from foreign competition even more, Herbert Hoover approves the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which takes the average tariff right up to about 60%. You recall the McKinley tariff wasn't quite so high. It was only at 55%. Well, some of the rates at which goods are going to be taxed as they're coming in are going to go up to 80%, the average right around 60%, which makes the Hawley-Smoot tariff the highest tariff in U.S. history. Now, I was at a AP conference at one time, and the presenter, who was an old history prof, said that the Hawley-Smoot tariff is the single most stupid thing the government of the United States has ever done. Now, I'm not keeping a list or anything, but I definitely think that the Hawley-Smoot tariff is up there. See, what you want to do in times of economic depression is to encourage countries to trade with one another and to encourage goods to flow in and out of different countries, and that will, in effect, stimulate economic growth. Economists know this now, and they generally disapprove of high tariffs between equal nations. But in 1932, this was less known, and so Herbert Hoover goes with his gut. He goes with what he believes is correct, and the result was in fact disastrous. You can see that world trade was falling from 1929, and the Hawley-Smoot tariff certainly did absolutely nothing to encourage world trade to pick up at all. So rather than make things better, what in fact most economists are going to tell you now is that the Hawley-Smoot tariff only made things worse, as other nations raised retaliatory tariffs and refused to import American goods, which further put Americans out of work. Well, in addition to raising tariffs, Herbert Hoover attempts to fight the Depression through the use of governmental power. Now, he's not going to do anything as far-reaching as the New Deal, but he is going to try to kickstart the economy. One of the ways that he does this is through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Congress proposes and he approves in early of 1932. Now, this is very much in keeping with the Republican philosophy of trickle-down economics. Over $1 billion in government money is going to be loaned out to railroads and large businesses. And that is hoping that they will be able to kickstart their operations once again, and by doing so employ people, and employing people will give people spending cash, and that will have a cyclical effect. He also wants to put money into the banks so that they can resume lending. And so if I've got an idea to start up a business now, the banks will be able to give me that startup capital, and I will be able to do that and employ people and jumpstart the economy again. The second of Herbert Hoover's measures is called the Mexican Repatriation Act, which Congress approves and proposes, and he signs in early 1932. Now, this is a little bit less memorable for us and a little bit more controversial, especially from our point in time. But what it means is it's the deportation, the forced deportation of the Mexican migrant workers in order to free up jobs in the agricultural sector, primarily the agricultural sector. And this does result in a lot of people getting moved back to Mexico. Neither one of these moves, neither the RFC or the Mexican Repatriation Act, is going to have the effect that Herbert Hoover would like. Now, I want to take the time and explain a little bit better what is known as supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. It's known from the 1890s really to the present day as trickle-down. Ronald Reagan is going to coin the term supply-side economics, so you're going to want to associate those two. They're more or less synonymous. The idea is for the government to relax the tax burden on the wealthiest income earners and on businesses. And what is this supposed to do is it's supposed to allow businesses and the wealthy to give less of their money to the government and to put more of it into the private sector. So this will encourage the wealthy to invest and big businesses to employ. And in doing so, new investments and new employment are supposed to simulate growth. So it literally starts at the top and it's supposed to trickle down. And so a way of looking at this is by saying that a rising tide raises all boats. And yeah, sure, this is true. Now, I'm not making a call on whether or not this works or doesn't work, because today, guys, Democrats and Republicans are continuing to fight the benefits or the drawbacks to trickle-down economics. Generally, Republicans are for it. Generally, Democrats are against it. And it goes through cycles. We see it in the 20s, we see it in the 80s, and then we see it again with George W. Bush in the early 21st century. But the idea is everybody is supposed to win. Another way in which Herbert Hoover tries to combat the effects of the Great Depression, namely unemployment, is by authoring a public works initiative. And this is something that FDR is going to expand on a nationwide scale. But right now, Herbert Hoover wants to employ people by putting a dam on the Colorado River. This has been something people have been considering for quite some time, and now we have more than enough reason to go ahead and get it done. So the Hoover Dam is completed in a series of stages, and as you can see, it begins under Herbert Hoover, and it's going to be completed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But it is one of these ways that Herbert Hoover is going to take public money, and he's going to put it into private investment. He's going to hire, or rather encourage, private contractors to go out and do this business. So even though it's, being kickstarted by the federal government, it's going into private hands who are going to build and employ and invest. Well, despite all these initiatives, Herbert Hoover's attempts to solve or to cure the Great Depression are not met with success. And one of the things that is really a public relations disaster for him happens with the so-called bonus army of 1932. You will recall that in 1917, John J. Pershing had helped to train the American Expeditionary Force, and they had gone over to France and more or less broken the stalemate on the Western Front, which led to a victory in World War I, an Allied victory. Well, in 1924, Congress, in gratitude to the AEF, met and approved a bonus payment that was to be collected by each of the doughboys in 1945. So you get a bonus, they say, congratulations and job well done, but this bonus will come to you as you reach retirement age in 1945. Well, we're really hungry now, say a lot of guys that served in the American Expeditionary Force, and they go and they ask Congress for this bonus early. They do it through legal means, they do it through their representatives, and it does go before Congress. And Congress and the President both decide, no, we're not going to start this. And this is, again, very much in keeping with Herbert Hoover's ideology. He's not going to start giving out handouts, even if these handouts, or what he sees as a handout, has been promised to them. They say, no, you'll wait till 1945. This is how it's going to be. Well, the bonus army, as they are now being called, says, we're not going to do this. And so they organize a march on Washington in December of 1932, and they're demanding that the Senate reconvene and reconsider their petition to be awarded this bonus several years early. And so there you are on the left, you see a picture of these this bonus army occupying Washington in 1932, for lack of a better word. 20,000 World War I veterans assemble from all over the country. And they bring with them their wives and their children, and they set up tents in sort of a makeshift refugee camp, if you will, outside of the Capitol. Now, they camped on the White House lawn, and they got a little bit, they became a little bit hostile toward the Senate when the Senate was not being responsive to their demands. And they began to occupy and shut down government buildings. So it is a form of social protest that extends beyond just asking Congress to act on your behalf. The Senate did agree to meet again, and when the Senate voted no, we are not going to award these bonuses early, then the bonus army, many of them anyway, refuse to disperse. Herbert Hoover gives perhaps the most unwise order of his career. He tells the army, not the bonus army, the regular army, surround the affected area and clear it without delay. In other words, get these bonus marchers out of here. The leader of the army, the general who was charged with clearing out the bonus army, his name was General Douglas MacArthur. His name is going to become more famous, especially as we approach the Pacific Front in World War II. And General MacArthur recalled his thinkings on breaking apart the bonus army. He says they, that is, the protesters, the bonus army, had come to the conclusion beyond the shadow of the doubt that they were about to take over in some arbitrary way either the direct control of the government or else to control it by indirect methods. So these guys are dangerous. They were getting really close to directing the course of our own government. MacArthur goes on and says, "It is my opinion that had the president not acted today, had he permitted this thing to go on for 24 hours more, he would have been faced with a grave situation, which would have caused a real battle. Had he let it go on another week, I believe that the institutions of our government would have been severely threatened." So General MacArthur clearly believes that President Hoover acted correctly in sending out the army to clear out the bonus army because it's democracy itself at stake. Herbert Hoover recalled, when asked about the bonus army, he said that they were dangerous Reds. In other words, he called them communists. Now, this is not a nice thing to call a veteran. I would personally never call a veteran a communist. Not if you expected to keep your nose intact, that is. Well, MacArthur followed Herbert Hoover's orders and used the means at his disposal to burn down the bonus army shack and disperse them through the use of tear gas and through the use of military force. A lot of people were hurt. A lot of babies ended up suffering. They brought their children, and one of the things that made the news was the babies got tear gassed, and it had a pretty deleterious effect on their health. So there you can see the army wearing these gas masks and the bonus army having to deal with the fumes that are being released on them. Here's one of these iconic photographs that when it reaches the newspapers the next day really causes Americans to step back and wonder what's going on in their country. The president's measures to cure the Depression have been largely unsuccessful. Unemployment is continuing to rise. And when a group of war veterans from World War I decide that they want their bonus early, they're asking their government to reward their service to their country early, the president himself orders the standing army to literally burn down their establishments and disperse them with force. And so here you've got their makeshift Hoovervilles out in front of the army, out in front of the Capitol, burning down, and the dome of the Capitol building in the background. So it's this very uncomfortable picture of authoritarian police force and democratic principles existing in the same shot. I think this is really an amazing photograph, and one that makes one consider and think and provoke, and it provokes a lot of thought about the role of the army and about the role of the government and about the role of all of these things. Well, I'm not the only one who's thinking about this. In 1932, somebody else was looking on, and that is the former vice presidential candidate and governor of New York. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When he sees Herbert Hoover's reaction to the bonus army, he declares to his confidants, "This elects me."